I still remember the day my parents told me to gather my belongings and wait outside. I was 14 and I'd just come home from school, expecting the usual routine of microwaved leftovers and half-hearted small talk. Instead, I found my mother standing by the couch, arms crossed, and my father pacing back and forth. They said they'd made a difficult decision for the good of the family. What that meant, I had no clue, but the tension in their voices made me uneasy. I was told I'd be living with my Uncle Bill for a while, that it was temporary. They offered no explanation beyond that. At first, I assumed it was a short stay, maybe a week or two, but when Uncle Bill pulled up in his old sedan, I noticed the trunk was open and my mother handed me a large duffel bag already packed with most of my clothes. There were no hugs, just curt instructions to get in and be grateful Bill was willing to take me in. My father avoided eye contact as he helped load my things. The entire exchange took less than 10 minutes. The door slammed behind them, and suddenly, I was in my uncle's car, watching our apartment building fade into the distance. It felt surreal, like I'd been plucked out of my life and tossed somewhere else without so much as a goodbye. Uncle Bill wasn't much of a talker, but he did his best to console me. Once we got to his house, a modest one-story in an older neighborhood, he showed me the small guest room that would become my bedroom. His expression was pained, like he hated the circumstances that brought me there. Still, he never badmouthed my parents. He said they felt they couldn't handle raising a teenager anymore, that they'd given up for reasons he didn't fully understand. He apologized on their behalf more than once, which only confused me further. If they loved me, why let me go so easily? I tried calling them several times in the days that followed, only to be met with silence. They had effectively disappeared from my life, blocking my number and leaving me in the care of an uncle who, until then, had mostly been a stranger. Despite the shock, I made an effort to settle in. Uncle Bill worked as a self-employed electrician, and he spent long hours on jobs around town. He wasn't married and had no kids of his own, so my presence in his home was new territory for both of us. Yet he never treated me like a burden. He helped me transfer schools, pay for books, and even encouraged me to join some after-school clubs. Over time, we developed a routine. He'd pack me a lunch in the morning before heading to a job site, and I'd come home to a friendly note on the counter letting me know when he'd return. In those early months, I was still waiting for my parents to realize they'd made a huge mistake. I assumed, naively, that they would come to their senses, show up, and apologize. That never happened. As I adjusted to life with Uncle Bill, I discovered I had more freedom and more responsibility than ever before. Bill made it clear he wasn't interested in being a strict parent, but he had expectations. Keep my grades up, contribute to chores, and be honest about my whereabouts. It was a refreshing change from living with parents who either micromanaged or ignored me depending on their mood. I started to see Uncle Bill as someone who genuinely cared, even if he wasn't outwardly sentimental. He was the kind of person who showed love through actions, not just words, and that resonated with me. One day, about a year into living there, I stumbled upon a stack of unopened letters in the kitchen drawer. They were all addressed to my parents, and from the return addresses, I recognized some as bills and others as official notices. My uncle confessed that my father had forwarded his mail to Bill's address without a heads up. He shrugged and said it wasn't a big deal, but something about that felt off. It was as though my parents couldn't be bothered to handle their own responsibilities. I asked if they'd ever inquired about me, and Uncle Bill hesitated before saying no. That was when it really sank in. My parents had severed ties completely. They'd moved, changed phone numbers, and left no forwarding information for me. I was, for all intents and purposes, out of their lives. Anger set in, followed by a deep sadness. Yet Uncle Bill was there every step of the way. He taught me how to fix basic electrical issues, how to replace a toilet valve, and even how to cook a halfway decent steak. I thrived under his laid-back mentorship. My grades improved, and I found a new passion for computers, something Bill encouraged wholeheartedly. He would drive me to the local library every weekend so I could use their internet to learn about coding and hardware. Before long, I was fixing old laptops and selling them online for pocket money. Bill noticed how excited I got whenever I completed a successful transaction, and he urged me to think about ways to turn that into a real career. When high school ended, the question of college came up. I had decent grades, but no savings and no parental support. Bill offered to help pay for community college, emphasizing the importance of education. He also encouraged me to keep pursuing the side hustle of repairing and flipping used electronics. The first 2 years of college were a blur of classes, part-time jobs, and late nights spent tinkering with secondhand computers. If I ever felt overwhelmed, Bill would remind me how far I'd come, that I was capable of more than I realized. He never gave me a pep talk about my parents. It was as though he knew that topic was a raw nerve. Instead, he channeled all his energy into guiding me, hoping I'd see that I was worth caring for, worth investing in. In that sense, he was more of a father than my biological one had ever been. During my sophomore year of community college, I took a risk. I used my savings to rent a small booth at a weekend tech market, where local enthusiasts gathered to buy, sell, and trade gadgets. Business was slow at first, but word spread about my knack for repairing devices that most people would have junked. Gradually, I built a reputation and earned a modest profit. Uncle Bill would stop by on Sundays to bring me lunch, looking proud as he surveyed the rows of laptops and phones I'd refurbished. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start, and I felt a growing sense of independence. Around that time, I bumped into a distant cousin who had more recent information about my parents. According to him, they'd moved to another state for a fresh start. The rumor was that they had racked up debt and burned bridges, which made them want to relocate and rebuild. There was no mention of me, no indication that they cared about what happened after they sent me off. It stung, but it also fueled my resolve. I decided I would succeed without them, not just to prove a point, but to validate the support Uncle Bill had shown me. If my parents thought I was disposable, I'd show them how wrong they were. When I finally earned my associate's degree, I opted to skip transferring to a university. Instead, I doubled down on my small electronics business, securing a tiny storefront in a rundown strip mall. The rent was cheap and the walls were barely holding together, but it was my first official step into entrepreneurship. Uncle Bill and I spent 2 weeks renovating the space, patching holes and painting walls. When I opened the doors, the initial foot traffic was minimal. I passed out flyers and relied on word of mouth. Eventually, a few customers trickled in, and I worked around the clock to make sure they left happy. Slowly, my reputation grew. Uncle Bill was a steady presence throughout this journey, offering the kind of emotional and financial support I never got from my parents. He didn't bankroll me, but he always had my back. If I needed to borrow his truck to pick up supplies or help moving furniture, he was there. And if I felt insecure about my abilities, he reminded me of how much I'd accomplished already. He even introduced me to some of his electrician buddies, who occasionally hired me to set up computer systems for their clients. Through those connections, I picked up corporate gigs, fixing office networks and configuring databases. The variety of work expanded my skill set and helped me turn a modest profit. That money went right back into the business. Even then, part of me wondered if my parents would ever surface again. I suspected they'd show up the moment they heard I was doing well, and I dreaded the day I might have to face them. But for a long stretch of time, they remained silent, and I focused on building my life the way I wanted. By the time I was 23, my modest storefront was turning a decent profit, enough that I could move out of Uncle Bill's place and rent a small apartment nearby. I'd grown used to living with him, but I felt it was time to test my independence. Even after I moved, we stayed close, having dinner together and discussing new ideas for the business. One afternoon, he mentioned the possibility of buying a building outright. He believed in real estate as a form of security, and he thought if I owned my workspace, I could save on rent and possibly expand. The idea appealed to me, but the numbers seemed too daunting. Uncle Bill simply told me, "We'll figure it out. Don't underestimate yourself." We spent months hunting for the right property, eventually finding a rundown 2-story with a small storefront on the ground floor and a living space above. It needed major renovations, but we saw potential. With Bill as my co-signer, I secured a loan, and we closed the deal. Renovations took nearly a year of weekends, late nights, and more money than I initially planned. We worked side by side, tearing down drywall, installing new wiring, and making the place livable. When it was done, I moved in upstairs, and my business occupied the newly remodeled shop below. That was when I first felt a tangible sense of stability, a real place of my own. Shortly after I reopened in the new location, I got a message on social media from a name that made my stomach churn. My father. It was short, just a couple of lines saying he hoped I was doing well and that he and my mother would like to talk. No apology, no acknowledgement of the years of silence. I froze, uncertain how to respond. Memories of that day they shipped me off came flooding back. Anger roiled in my gut. After everything, they suddenly wanted to talk? I left the message unanswered for a week. Finally, I showed it to Uncle Bill, who just said, "Do whatever feels right. You don't owe them anything." I decided to block him and move on. But that was just the beginning. A few weeks later, my mother emailed me a rambling apology that ended with a request for money. She claimed they'd lost their jobs and needed help to cover rent. The email read more like a sales pitch than a genuine attempt to reconnect. I didn't reply. I stewed in anger, half expecting them to show up at my doorstep unannounced. I told Bill I wanted revenge, but I wasn't sure how to get it without stooping to their level. He told me I didn't need to do anything drastic because living well was already the best payback. I took his words to heart, focusing on my grand opening celebration for the new shop and ignoring every message from my parents. Eventually, they stopped emailing for a while, probably sensing I wouldn't budge. I poured everything into making my business a local staple, offering competitive rates and honest service. The grand opening went better than I ever imagined. Local media covered my story. A young entrepreneur who had worked his way up from selling refurbished laptops to opening a brick-and-mortar tech repair shop. Uncle Bill teased me about being a minor celebrity, but I knew the real star was the support he'd given me. We celebrated over pizza in the tiny break room behind the store. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness that my parents weren't there to see it, even though I also knew they hadn't earned an invite. A few months later, my father made an unexpected appearance in person. He strolled into my shop as if nothing had happened, wearing a forced smile and carrying a shopping bag. I recognized him right away, though he looked older, thinner. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to remain calm. He greeted me like a long-lost friend, ignoring the tension in the air. It was surreal. After a moment of awkward small talk, he admitted he needed financial help. He tried to spin a story about bad investments and how he and my mother were in dire straits. I asked him point blank why they'd cut me off. He offered a vague explanation about stress and not knowing how to handle a teenager. No real apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a shallow plea for money. I stared at him, feeling a decade's worth of anger and resentment building in my chest. I told him I owed him nothing, that he'd forfeited any right to call himself my father the day he sent me to Bill's doorstep. He tried to but I ushered him out, telling him never to set foot in my shop again. My employees looked shocked, but I felt only relief once he was gone. Uncle Bill heard about the incident and asked me how I felt. I said I felt oddly empowered, but still furious. He suggested I let it go, that I focus on the positive aspects of my life. I tried, but my parents kept finding new ways to contact me. My mother sent letters full of sob stories about mounting debts and how they'd always loved me despite making mistakes. They begged me for a loan, promising to pay it back eventually. The hypocrisy was overwhelming. I drafted several scathing responses but never sent them. Instead, I discussed the situation with a lawyer friend who volunteered at our local business association. She advised me on how to handle potential harassment and told me that if my parents continued, I could send a cease and desist letter. It was a drastic measure, but the thought of legally shoving them out of my life was tempting. Then came the day I decided to serve my revenge cold. I arranged a meeting in a public cafe, inviting both of my parents through a single email address they had been using. I didn't tell Uncle Bill right away, partly because I wasn't sure how he'd react. I was determined to finally confront them, to stand up for myself, and to let them know exactly how they'd failed me. They arrived at the cafe, looking disheveled and uncomfortable. My father tried to hug me, but I stepped back. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off, telling them I wanted to get straight to the point. I laid out everything I'd felt since the day they put me in Uncle Bill's car. I reminded them how they never reached out during my high school years, never visited me at Bill's house, and how they blocked my calls when I needed them most. I brought up my college graduation, which they hadn't even bothered to ask about, and the fact that they hadn't offered a single cent to help me get started in life. The entire time, they sat there, eyes darting around like they wanted to escape. When I finally paused, my father cleared his throat and tried to spin the same story about financial hardship and stress. He said they assumed Uncle Bill would be a better caretaker and that they did it out of love. That was the last straw. I laughed, a bitter sound even to my own ears. I told them love isn't sending your child away without explanation. Love isn't changing your number and disappearing for years. I demanded they stop pretending it was anything but selfishness and cowardice. My mother started crying, saying she was sorry, but the tears seemed more driven by desperation than genuine remorse. Then I got to the real reason I'd asked them to meet me. I pulled out a piece of paper from my bag, a contract I'd drafted with the lawyer friend's help. It stated that if they wanted any money from me, they would have to sign over any claim to my future earnings, inheritance rights, and even the right to contact me again after a certain date. The terms were severe, practically guaranteeing I'd never have to deal with them again. I looked them in the eye and told them this was their help. They could take it or leave it. If they truly needed a loan, I'd give them a small sum, but the interest rate and conditions would be exorbitant. My father's face turned red. He asked if I was really that vindictive, if this was how I treated my own flesh and blood. I replied that blood had nothing to do with it. They made their choice years ago, and now I was making mine. They refused to sign, calling me cruel, saying I was twisting the knife. I told them that was rich coming from the people who hadn't cared whether I slept under a bridge or in a warm bed for most of my teenage years. My mother sobbed, my father spat angry words, and I sat there, unflinching. Eventually, they stormed out, calling me ungrateful and heartless. I took a moment to steady my breathing. Then I left too, feeling more satisfied than I ever had. This was my revenge, letting them see who I'd become, knowing they had no part in it, and offering them a deal so one-sided they'd never dare accept it. I told Uncle Bill about the meeting later that day, expecting him to scold me for being too harsh. Instead, he sighed and said he understood. He'd seen firsthand how they neglected me and how that shaped my life. He reiterated that the best revenge was living well, but he also admitted that sometimes you have to draw a firm boundary, one that shows people the consequences of their actions. From that point on, I felt freer. I had no illusions that my parents would leave me alone forever, but I knew I had taken control of the narrative. They'd never again catch me off guard with tears or guilt trips. In the years that followed, my business expanded. I hired a small team, opened a second location in the next town over, and even started selling my own custom-built computers. I also managed to buy Uncle Bill a small property of his own, a token of gratitude for everything he'd done. Watching him light up as I handed him the keys to his new place was priceless. That was the day I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I thought back to that 14-year-old kid who sat in Bill's car, terrified and confused. He'd come a long way. Then came the day I confronted my father for the final time. He showed up at my main store, looking ragged and desperate, claiming my mother had left him and he needed help. I stared him down, reminded him that he was the one who'd failed as a father, and told him to walk away. No forgiveness, no leniency. If he needed shelter, he could look elsewhere, because he had no place in my life. The look in his eyes told me he finally understood the depth of his mistakes. And that, in the end, was all the closure I needed. He slunk out, and I haven't heard from him since. Today, I still own that renovated building, living upstairs and running my business downstairs. I've got employees who rely on me, a community that supports me, and an uncle who stands by my side. My parents remain a distant memory, occasionally surfacing in stories I tell about my past, but never a source of pain anymore. I don't forgive them, and I don't regret that decision. They made their choice, and I made mine. The success I've built stands as proof that I never needed them, and that sometimes the best revenge is to flourish in the life they threw away. There's a sense of poetic justice in that, a lasting reminder that betrayal doesn't have to break you. Sometimes it can even make you stronger.